Well, I feel particularly privileged today to be here with a lady who, although she retired in 1984, hasn't sat still for a moment since then. And Ruth Rosenthal and I go back quite a while together. Ruth, I'm just going to ask you to talk a little bit, if you will, about your family, about the kids, and about the grandchildren, which I know you have. Tell us a little bit about you and your family.
Well, um, I had 3 children. Bob and Eric were twins, and Laurel was 3.5 years younger. It's interesting that although Henny, my husband, had a very close relationship with the boys, it was Laurel that there was sometimes even no need for communication. They understood each other. Bob is a Suffolk County police officer for somewhere around 25, 26 years now. He's the armorer for Suffolk County, loves guns. And Eric is one of the foremen here in Buildings and Grounds. And Laurel became a physician, and she is now the medical director of the South Brookhaven Health Center. And if you could remember the attributes of Henny,
Yes.
His dedication, his forthrightness, his essential honesty, and his caring about people, those are exactly the same qualities that we find cropping up in all 3 of them. But Laurel is the one who can use them the most because she has the most interaction with people, and she cares.
That's absolutely wonderful. Now, Henny died in 1980.
And with Henny, I think anyone who ever knew him will never forget him.
Are there any?
My grandchildren, I can't forget those.
I was
I
just
have
going to ask
2 more categories. Jason, Eric's son, is a police officer in New York City. Ruthie, Eric's daughter, is in college now in her 2nd year. Bobby is working for the district in Buildings and Grounds. It's Bob's son.
Wow.
And Bob's daughter, Jennifer, was our valedictorian in 1990. And she went to NYU, graduated, I think it was summa cum laude. She's a member of Phi Beta Kappa, and she's studying to be a school psychologist. Then there are 2 more, Laurel's 2 children. Catherine she's just unreal. She is mature in many ways. She is highly intellectual, and she grasps things with a great deal of ease. And Owen, who is the youngest of the grandchildren, she's going to be 10. Owen is going to be 9. Owen he has a tremendous ability with mechanical things. He reminds me very much of Henny and the 2 boys. They like to take everything apart, then put it back together again. A great deal of visual imagination. Then I have 2 great-grandchildren.
Oh, my goodness.
Jason had a little boy a year ago in March 4th. In fact, I was still recovering from my surgery when the baby was born. And he is absolutely, absolutely gorgeous. He's a little more than a year now. He's a very, very happy little child, smiling or reaching out to people.
Do you get a chance to see them often? Are they here? They're right here.
Oh yes, all of them are here. All of them. And he loves animals, so he's a true Rosenthal. And I wasn't so sure about the youngest. He's only 4.5. But he was at my home the other day, and I brought in the 2 dogs. And when he saw them, I heard a squeal. I didn't know where it was coming from. It didn't sound like a baby, but it was a squeal of pure delight.
Delight.
So he's a Rosenthal too.
Yes.
I'd like to mention a couple of other people.
Sure.
Eric's wife, Anna, is in charge of the emergency room at the South Nassau Hospital in Oceanside. And she is top-notch. She's a graduate of Brentwood High also. Bob's wife is a homemaker. And that's all she ever wanted to achieve. And she's a wonderful homemaker.
Wonderful.
And Laurel's husband is a teacher. He teaches music, he teaches computers, and he teaches reading.
So that rounds it out.
Yeah. I've never asked them what they think about me, but when I speak with any of them, the last sentence in the conversation is, "I love you, Grandma."
Oh, there it is. Yeah. Why did you decide to retire?
It was a mistake.
Was it?
It really was.
You're still very, very active.
Yes, I am, and I always tried to have the connection with children, especially the children of Brentwood, because they're very important to me.
I'm interested to pursue that. Yes.
I made a mistake.
Okay.
No question in my mind. I made a mistake. And of course, I had lost Henny just a few years before that. And I didn't have his support.
Yes.
I felt a little bit lost. The only security I had was in school, really. This is where I belong. This is what I knew.
Yes.
And this is what I wanted to do. So that was an error. And I caution people who tell me they want to retire. Retire to something, not from something.
I'm glad you mentioned that retire.
I was a principal of a K-3 school. It was part of Southwest, but distinctly by itself. And I thought, I really don't have any background in dealing with these little ones. And I realized that number one, they were children. Number two, the basic character of the 6, 7, 8-year-old is not too much different from the basic character of the senior high student.
Yes.
Just different in degrees, and in the difference in the, not in the type of problems, but in the maturity level of the problems. And I enjoyed it. I loved it. Let's put it this way. I worked extremely well with Stan Yankowski.
Yes.
I was very close to him. I understood him. I respected him. And Stan left. And some of the things that I had been doing were no longer approved. For example, at the end of the year, I wrote a letter of commendation to each teacher who had done something special. It wasn't the end of the year evaluation. This was a thank you letter.
Just a thank you letter, right.
And I was told that that was not going to continue because it had no negatives in it, just positives, and that appalled me.
Yes.
Well, I started in '56, and I really have never stopped.
Yes.
So it's been from '56, 40 years.
40 years till now. Now, why don't you tell the viewer what you've been doing since your retirement, since in the 12 years?
Well, for 2 years, I taught courses all over the island on how to teach science. That science was the easiest subject to teach because the kids could get involved if they were dealing with concrete things. And that a child who had no patience to sit still could remain in his seat, attentive and working for a half an hour, 45 minutes at a time, because he was interested in what he was doing. It was something he can manipulate. Well, actually, I was recommended from one school to another. And I spent a couple of years in doing that. And I really enjoyed it. And the teachers' attitudes changed so dramatically. I said that science is the only subject that you can truly say when you're asked a question, you don't know the answer. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer, but I'll look it up. We'll find out what the answer is. It's not like a math problem where you have to come up with the right answer. And it's perfectly all right in science to come up with an unorthodox answer because that could very well be the true answer in a year or so.
True.
I've loved it. I've loved it all the way through. Then I got involved with the library board in Brentwood. We have the most magnificent library in Suffolk County. And then I became involved with the school board. And that I find the most challenging because we affect the lives of so many children. And
you have been a trustee for how many years?
6 years for the school board. No, wait a second. Yeah. And in fact, I'm in my 8th year now. It's not 6. 6 years, 2 terms completed.
Okay.
And 1 term that I'm still fulfilling it, that won't be over until next year. I am enjoying it. And I also am a coach for the Science Olympiad team.
Oh my. Okay.
And they are absolutely fantastic. They have been the top science team on Long Island for years and years and years. And they've gone up to compete at West Point. And they're just incredible, these young people. The things they come up with, the organization abilities they have, the creativity they have, phenomenal. Well, I was communicating with a sergeant. He was a
Now, you were in the military?
tech sergeant.
You were in the military.
Well, I had been, yes, all the way through the war.
Tell me about that before we go ahead.
Okay. I was with the Signal Corps from the beginning of World War II until 1945. And I was a mechanical engineer specializing in sound and light and radio equipment. And some of my projects are still being used today, like the radio sound. And after that, I was with the Navy and then the Veterans Administration. Then in 1945, I communicated with a staff sergeant overseas who was a friend of my girlfriend's husband. And she said, Ben has a friend overseas and we think you would enjoy corresponding with him and he with you. So I wrote to Staff Sergeant Herman Rosenthal in some godforsaken place in the Pacific. And when he came home, we corresponded for about 6 months. And when he came home, he called and we saw each other. And 5 days later, we were engaged. And within, 2.5 weeks after that, we were married.
What a wonderful story that is.
And it's another case of just knowing.
Yes.
When I met Henny, I knew that of all the people in the world, he was the one I wanted to spend my life with.
How wonderful. So there began another chapter.
Another chapter. Henny's parents had lived out here since 31. In fact, Henny was inducted into the Army in from Brentwood. That was his resident board. And after that, after we were married, we remained in New York for about a year, Brooklyn. And then we came out to Long Island to see Mom and Pop Rosenthal. And I thought, this is a wonderful place to live.
And this is after war. This is after the war. This is in.
Oh yes, it was after the
late
war.
Late 40s, no, mid 40s.
And I changed my place of occupation to the Veterans Administration Hospital over in Northport.
I see.
I was in charge of all civil service exams, and Henny went to one job in mechanics, so different fields. And then he decided to go into business with a friend. They went into building, and they did very nicely. Construction of homes, and a couple of churches along the way, all in this area.
Yes.
And then one day, I said to Henny, you're working very, very hard, because he's come home after a day's work completely exhausted. And he said, I'm going over to GL&F. That was the local grain and feed store on Suffolk Avenue.
Mhm.
He said, what are you going there? I said, I'm going to get some hay. He says, hay is for horses. We don't have any horses here. And you know what the next line was? If you're going to work like a horse, I'm going to feed you like a horse. And he applied to Hofstra. He got his, because he was a high school dropout. He was in the CCC, because he had to earn money to support, help pay the rent for the family,
Right.
and that just did it.
During the Depression years.
Yeah, during the Depression. He dropped out at the end of the 10th year. So he had to go back to Brentwood High, get his diploma,
Marvelous.
and he applied to Hofstra and was there for 3.5 years, majoring in biology, geology, and French as a minor.
Mm-hmm.
And when he was graduated, he, of course, took the courses for teaching and became a teacher. I was teaching.
You were teaching at that point?
Yes.
Ah.
Henny graduated from college in '62, and I had been teaching since '57.
All
I
right.
worked during the day. He went to college during the day.
How did you get into the district then? What's the story there? How did you happen to connect and
Well,
apply to
I
Brentwood?
started as a substitute teacher, and one day I met Dr. Eugene Hoyt.
Yes.
Online, and he said to me,
Dr. Hoyt was the district
principal at the time. He said to me, where would you rather be, in elementary school or high school teaching science? I said, high school teaching science. He said, go over and tell Fred Weaver I just hired you. So later on, I asked him, whatever made you make that offer to me? And he said, well, my son had been in a few classes where you were the substitute, and he came home and raved about you. He said, not only is she an excellent teacher, but she has eyes in the back of her head. She knows what I'm doing when I'm in back of her. So he said, I figured I could use someone like that.
That's a wonderful story.
And of course, the faculty at that time was phenomenal.
Yes.
Morris Clayman was the head of the department, and he didn't remain there too long. And he was a very nice person.
The science
teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Frank Lashicott was a biology teacher. I taught the earth sciences. Dave Martz taught chemistry. And Darrell Rathbun taught physics. And we got along splendidly. Frank Lashicott would always do amazing things, but he was always a gentleman and a good friend. Yes. And Dave had that wonderful sense of humor and that devilish little smile that always used to amuse me. We became very good friends. It was in the 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62.
Right at the time of the real growth spurt.
Oh, yes.
In this district.
And it was exciting, because there were new ideas coming up all the time, and Dr. Hoyt encouraged them.
But you had known Brentwood before this happened.
So sure.
Tell me about the Brentwood that you remembered when you first came out here to meet Henny.
It was very lovely. Brentwood Road and Suffolk Avenue and Washington Avenue had a canopy of trees. Trees met over these roads. Yes. And there was no one really thought about locking their doors. You could go away and leave your doors open. Nothing would happen. If you wrote a letter to the Rosenthals and sent it to the Bayshore post office, they would mail it over to Brentwood, because everyone knew everyone. We had maybe 2,500, 3,000 people living in all of Brentwood.
It was truly a rural community.
Was rural. Then, yes. And if you went down Washington Avenue, at the end of Washington Avenue, you came to the Vanderbilt Motor Parkway, which had one lane, not one lane in each direction, one lane.
Is that right?
So if you pulled onto the parkway, cut the motor, and sat very quietly in your car, with a very short time, you'd see deer coming across. And it was very, very lovely, very lovely. Although my first experience in Brentwood, with Brentwood winter, was a winter of, I guess it was 57, 56, 57, where we had that tremendous snowfall.
Mm.
And I thought, oh my God, we're isolated, but we really weren't. The people next door and your neighbors were all there to help with whatever they could. It was great.
What about the school system itself in the early your early tenure? What do you remember about?
We had the what is now part of the library.
Yes.
The old administration building, but that had formerly been a schoolhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And when they started to grow, that became the district principal's office and special ed.
I see.
2 classrooms of special ed, that
see.
was it. We had the village school. And then gradually, one elementary school after another. There were times when we couldn't house the children we had in schools. So they rented storefronts on Islip Avenue, on Suffolk Avenue, and the children went to school
So
in the stores.
before the building program got started in earnest,
Well,
after village,
even when it was ongoing,
oh really?
We were growing so fast.
fast.
It was one development after another.
Mm-hmm.
Young couples with children.
Mm-hmm.
And they all ended up in the Brentwood schools.
Mm-hmm.
The most profound change, and probably the one that I think has the greatest influence in preparing our young people for the world, is the fact that we became so multicultural. And children, from the time they were in kindergarten, were with children of different backgrounds, different religions, didn't look like them at all. But they realized, because little children don't have any truly built-in antis,
Right.
that,
right.
that they were friends.
Mm-hmm.
Prejudice wasn't, as they say in South Pacific, prejudice is something you have to teach.
Be carefully taught is right.
And be carefully taught.
Yes.
So that our young people come out having had the experience of dealing with and being friends with people of many, many backgrounds. And I think that's the most valuable thing they come away with, in addition to an excellent education.
And one of the things that I think dovetails perfectly with that is that this community, in so many ways, would you not agree, is a microcosm of this country?
Oh,
at
it
this
is.
time.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. The only thing is that people in Brentwood have learned how to get along with each other.
Oh, this is very true.
Whereas other parts of the country are far, far behind.
Yes, yes. Let me ask you, Ruth, about the different positions that you have held along your career path. You began as a teacher of science.
Science teacher.
And then what?
Then one day in 61, Dr. Hoyt came to me and said, I need someone to coordinate all of the sciences in the district. I want a program in the elementary school all the way through. And he said, I would like you to do that at the end of the following year. But you have to start now. So in addition to teaching, I start gathering a program together for the elementary school, reorganizing the junior high programs. And that's how the second phase began. Mm-hmm. In 1967, I received a call from Dr. Nannini, who was then the current supervising principal.
Or was it still supervising principal at that time?
I think it was at the very beginning, but then it changed to superintendent. Okay. Anyway, Dr. Nannini said, we have a problem in one of the schools. I want to change the administration focus. He said, and I need you there in charge of curriculum. So that was my second assignment after teaching. But I still continued doing the science budget for years and years. I'd handle that every year.
Meanwhile, concurrent with this, you're being moved from building to building. You're moving.
Well, I went from here to East Junior.
Okay.
And then after about 7 years there, I got a call from Stan Yankowski.
Mhm.
I need you here. Oh,
Isn't it wonderful to be needed?
Mr. Howland, Steve Howland, who was a principal at East, he said, I can't really say no. So I came here, and then later on I met Steve at some retirement party, and he said, you know, we all make mistakes in our life. He said, but the biggest mistake I made in education was to let you go.
Oh, what a
Which
nice
I thought was
comment.
wonderful.
Oh, what a nice thing to say.
But I made many friends along the way.
Now, after that assignment,
I went to the senior high as part of the administrative team with Harvey Brickman and I, and Frank Lashicott was for a while the dean, but then he was made an AP too. So we had a 3 principal team in each of the buildings. I was in Sonderling, and
Yes.
Dave and his team was in Ross.
Ruth, it occurs to me to ask that how you felt as a member of the teaching staff at a particular point, being a member of the organization, because you, I assume, were a member of the teachers' organization
Oh,
back
yes.
then.
In fact, I was terribly hurt when we had to separate.
Yes, that when
We
the
had to
decision
form
had to be
BIPSO,
made.
yes.
Hmm. And it's at that point,
Because I
of
never
course.
forgot that I was a teacher.
Right.
And I would tell the faculty at least once a year what I make my business to remember all the year, that while I may be called a principal, the full title is principal teacher.
You're absolutely
I'm a
right.
teacher,
Yes.
and I understand what the
Yes.
problems are. And my only purpose is to be of help to you and help the children.
What a wonderful thing to say to teachers when they know that is your heart.
Oh,
that is
yeah,
speaking.
they knew.
Yes.
They
Yes.
knew.
You've mentioned that you're involved even now with activities like the
Science
Science
Olympiad.
Olympiad. Did you have time along the way with all your other involvements to work with students?
I
in
made
activities? Did you? To advise and sponsor things?
I made time.
Like one of those busiest people who always has time
Yeah,
to
you
add
always
something
give
else.
them
What did you
something
do?
else.
What were you doing?
I was working with the students in rocks, minerals, and fossils.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a wonderful time.
Wonderful.
When I was teaching, the science fair was tremendously important, but not for the obvious reasons. I required that every student turn in a project.
Mm-hmm.
And I said it doesn't have to be just in earth science. It could be earth science and social studies, how
Mm-hmm.
the earth has affected what's happened to people. It could be earth science and art, whatever it is. You can go into that, or stories, writing little vignettes or little fictional stories. And so I tried to give each child a focus. But then the next important part was, first of all, they were doing something. The second thing was that in the award ceremony, I never could make up my mind as to who was the top. I always had a few. And I always had many others who were second place and lots who were third place. And honorable mention took care just of everybody else. So everyone came away with a pat on the shoulder. I had one other experience I have to tell you about.
Yes.
I don't know how this started actually, but one day when I was in my earth science Regents class, and I had a lot of the top kids, I said, you know, we misuse words. We use words in a context that they never were intended to fill. I said, for example, and I wrote on the board, I wrote nationality. I said, that's one of them. Then I turned to a youngster who had a typical Italian family name. And I said, what's your nationality? He told me Italian. Are there any other Italians in the room? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then I asked another youngster who had a typical Irish name what his nationality was. And he told me Irish. So I went through that.
Yes.
And by the time I got finished with the class, I had a whole kaleidoscope of nationalities. And then I said, well, I really have to identify myself. And I wrote, Ruth Rosenthal, American.
Yes.
I said, how many of you were born overseas? No one.
Yes.
I said, were you born in the United States? And almost everyone in New York State, almost everyone on Long Island. I said, I didn't ask you where your grandparents came from. I asked you your nationality.
Yes.
And some of them still argued with me. And I said, you know, it has occurred to me that the only time the people of the United States think of themselves as one nation is when the nation is in trouble, when we're at war. Then they decide they're all Americans.
Yeah.
I tried the same experiment with a college course I was teaching for Hofstra at the same time, a graduate course in geology. Got the same result.
This is amazing. I think that the nature of an excellent education has changed very little with the passing of years. Excellence is still excellence. But what year were you born, Ruth?
Well, actually, I was born during World War I, 1 month before it ended, on October 9th, 1918.
And where were you born?
Brooklyn.
Okay. Now, can you tell us all a little bit about your mom and dad, about your mother and father?
My mother and father? My father was a giant of a man, not so much in weight, but in height. He was easily 6'4". He was a gentle, sweet person, intelligent, yes, but never mercenary. And he was kind to everyone he came in contact with.
Sounds like a gentle giant to me, the way you describe it.
And my mother was a petite little woman. She was 5'2", and she was all over the place. Friends described her to me as a little brown robin, just all over the place, but the same basic character attributes. Mom couldn't resist the plea for help.
Okay.
And when I was growing up, we had a factory built in back of our home, and they manufactured sweaters.
Oh.
And then they manufactured men's clothing. And we had, I would say about 30 people working for us. But there were groups of people who did certain things based on their own background. For example, the finishing of the clothing, the fine points, were done by hand. And almost invariably, the people who came to work in that area were Italian, mostly Sicilian, mothers and grandmothers. My mother spoke about 9 languages, and she spoke Italian.
My goodness.
So that there was no problem in communication. If there was a death in the family, my mother took the lady out and dressed her in black from head to toe, everything, brand new. If there was another death 6 months later, same procedure. If someone came and said, I need to loan some money, in those days, $100 was a fortune.
You bet.
Absolutely. And if they said $100, my father would say yes, write out a check for $100, give it to them. And he says, I expect this to be repaid. No interest, a quarter a week.
Wow.
That was the arrangement he made. And then he used to say, I couldn't be where I am. I couldn't have achieved what I am without these people. They're good people. And in any way I can help them, I will. In fact, the unions were furious with my father. Because every time they came down to organize the people working for him, they would say, you're crazy. We get more here than we would get in your finest union shop. And we're treated with care, with consideration. And for example, we had a standing order with a bus company in Brooklyn that when the temperature reached 90, everybody stopped work. The bus came around, picked them all up, and took them to Far Rockaway for the day at the beach. And then bus would bring them back in time. Because he said, that's not a temperature at which to work in a shop.
Oh, wonderful.
That was my father and my mother.
Yes. You had brothers and sisters?
A sister died before I was born. And I had an older brother who was 15 years my elder. And I think I was his favorite person in the world until I learned how to say no. He was probably a genius in math. And he couldn't understand why his sister didn't get 100 at every math test she took. But it was like having a junior father. He was much rougher on me than my father was.
So you were a middle child then, were you?
The last child.
Oh, you were the last child.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Oh. You've described an idyllic picture of growing up in a family. Was the family was your growing up a good experience?
Yes, except that I grew up during the Depression.
Okay.
Except that I never spent much time in worrying what it would, although I did remember what it was like when the family did have money.
Give me an example of some of your earliest memories.
My earliest memories was of living in 93 Georgia Avenue in East New York in Brooklyn, of having dogs around me always. They were always my friends. We had a big porch in front, and that was my favorite place, on a stationary swing on a porch. And I'd sit and eat tiny little tomatoes from the garden next door and read. And that probably was my favorite occupation. I also remember the fact that my father bought a car. His first car, a Scribbs Booth, was 1922. It was an open touring car. And we had that for quite a few years. But when we all went out as a family, and I hate to say this, but this was true, my brother was very much the young man, and he had a tendency to go faster than the speed limit. So my job when the family went out, including his wife, I would stand behind in the middle, and I'd say, "Daddy, Milton is going 25 miles an hour." And my father would say, "In the city?" I remember that very, very clearly. There was a lady, little tiny lady also, who was foreign born, and who loved me very, very much. And at one time I became very ill, and they had very little hope of my surviving. So she went to my mother and she said, "Look, Emma, you haven't had very good luck with daughters. You've lost one, and you're on your way to losing another one. I'll buy her from you for 2 cents.
My goodness, yes.
And I've never lost a child. And you'll see, she'll recover." And my mother, in spite of the fact that she was heartbroken, she felt such a sense of communication with this woman that she said, "All right, I'll take 2 cents for her." And then, of course, when I recovered, see, I told you so.
See,
that was Mrs. Schneider. Then the family upstairs, who lived there for a short period of time, they had a son who was about my age. And Bob and I were very, very good friends. And we met again in college. And we both majored in geology. But Bob was another influence. Some teachers I had. Unfortunately, my stay in elementary school classes was, I skipped 3 years, which means 6 of my classes, I was only, I was only there for a few weeks. and then I'd be passed on to the next
Yes.
level. And I remember a Miss Meshman, Mrs. Meshman, a Miss Rogers, who was the typical picture of a teacher, tall, thin, blonde, long skirt, white top, always beautifully tailored. And I remember they're all very wonderful. And some of the teachers I had in high school were also very important to me. I remember my father's mother and dad. My grandfather died when I was 2, but I remember it. We had a Seder at my grandmother's house. And after the Seder was over, my grandfather said, I think I'll take something warm to drink. I think I have indigestion. And that night he died from what they call acute indigestion in those days, which was a heart attack.
Yeah.
Grandma lived for a while after that, quite a few years. In fact, she died when I was about 10. And she was a beautiful, beautiful lady with lovely features and blue eyes. I always loved those blue eyes. And whenever I came in, she'd say, I have to make something for you, make you a treat. Chocolate soda, milk, chocolate, and seltzer.
Yes.
I remember that. PS 173 on Pennsylvania Avenue in Brooklyn.
You wouldn't have known at that time, but looking back now, can you tell us who was president at that point?
It was Wilson when I was born, and I think Coolidge was after him.
Okay.
And then, of course, there was Hoover.
Yes.
I did go to a junior high, but that was a particular kind of a junior high. It was called the RA School, Rapid Advance, and we covered 3 years' work in 2 years. And that was PS 84, Glenmore Junior High, which was, again, this was in Brownsville on Stone Avenue. And while I was there, incidentally, I remember some of the closings of the banks and the bank holidays and the people standing on line, banks failing, going all the way around the block.
People in social studies classes today look at this as ancient history.
Oh, no.
They have no idea how close
it's
that
very,
these things
very
were.
real. People who had invested their money in savings in certain institutions lost everything. Others, it took years for them to get back any money. And then we had the bank holiday, and I remember that too. After junior high, I went to Thomas Jefferson High School, and our principal was Dr. Elias Lieberman. As a distant relative of mine down south, I once had a conversation, and I said, do you often speak with your principal? He said, oh, Aunt Ruth, I don't mess with my principal. Well, that was Dr. Lieberman.
Yes.
He was very impressive, very kind, but we kept him in such a sense of awe. He wrote a poem that every student in the high school learned, I Am an American, 2 stanzas. One was a daughter of the American Revolution and son of the, Revolutionary War, and the other was an immigrant child. And it's still in some of the books somewhere, but he was an absolutely wonderful man. Of course, my high school had some incredible teachers.
That's what I was going to, I'm glad you mentioned that. Do you remember any of the people that you had in high school as teachers?
Yeah. I remember some wonderful teachers. And one of the truly finest was a Spanish teacher. And I loved Spanish. I took to it like a duck to water. It was the easiest thing in the world for me to learn. And we put on performances all the time in the auditorium, dressed in costumes, and we sang these Spanish songs like Si Bonet and Aquellos Ojos Verdes and Cielito Lindo. And
there's another example of something I never knew about you, Ruth. I did not know that you were bilingual.
I took French, which I loved, until I had one teacher And that made me realize how important it is to relate to your kids, to be sensitive of their feelings. And I took Latin in college, which I thought was wonderful. It suddenly became, I could understand why people hung on to Latin for so long, because it is so perfect. There are no misunderstandings in Latin. And then I took German, then I took Italian.
So you
And
followed.
all of these languages, with the exception of Latin, of course, came in very handy when I worked with the induction center, because I had to deal with people who were American
I would
citizens
imagine.
but spoke different languages. And in those days, it was fresh.
Yes. Were there any subjects that you had an aversion to? Were there any subjects in school that you didn't enjoy?
I never was good in art. I could appreciate it. I could draw magnificent studies in the microscope, two-dimensional, but ask me to draw anything three-dimensional, unless it was a block diagram with simplest 3 dimensions. I could not paint, and my drawing was very, very stilted.
Where did you do your higher education? I wanted to ask you that. Where?
I started at Hunter College in New York, which was a college for girls. And the reason for that was my parents didn't think it was such a good idea to send a child of 15 into a mixed environment with boys who would be 3, 4, 5 years older than she was. So I went to Hunter College. After being there for a few years, we had to go back to the city. I went to the Bronx buildings, which was like the campus. It was lovely. I didn't like going to school in New York City. By then I was old enough to say, I want to go to Brooklyn College, which has just started. And so I transferred there, got my degree from Brooklyn. And then I had courses at Hofstra, at NYU, all over the place, CCNY, all of them.
Where was the training that you received to become a teacher adequate to the demands that you met when you got into the classroom?
Because in those days, all you needed was a college diploma. You learned on the job, and you either made it or you didn't. And if you made it, you went on to take the education courses. They gave you 5 years to complete it.
Well, I gathered from what you said before about the the wonderful people that were on staff when you came, that you had a lot of help in your on-job training.
Harvey Brickman was tremendous. Ralph Buller in math was wonderful. I had quite a few friends in the English department. Helen Smith, and there was a very close friend. And there were a group of us who used to meet: Helen, Joyce Turner, myself, and 1 or 2 others. We used to have lunch together. But there were some very, very important friendships that were made.
Speaking of that, the friendships that you made with your teachers is probably a pattern that was followed through with your students and yourself. Did you have you had students maintain contact with you over the years?
I don't know how it started. Yes, I've been in contact with some of them all the way through. But when I became ill last year, I got a call from a former student who is now a professor of geology in Oregon State. And he told me that they had just moved into a new home overlooking the Pacific up on a bluff. He said, you would love it. He said, as part of your recuperation, why don't you come out and spend a couple of months with us? He said, I'll take you all over the state and show you for the first time the things you taught us about.
How wonderful.
And I've had people in California, in Florida, and of course locally too, that have kept in touch.
Have you seen changes in kids over the years?
In certain ways, yes, but in important ways, no. And when you work with a group of children now, you realize that they may march to a different beat or dance to a different rhythm, but they still have the same interests and loyalties and concerns. In fact, they're more concerned now than they were when I was young, because when I was young, our main concern was surviving.
Yes.
Where a nickel was tremendously important, and a quarter before 5 o'clock could get you a complete Chinese meal on Sutter Avenue, which was the big street. But outside of that, they are the same. They have the same needs, and their need for understanding and support is tremendous. But kids are kids.
There was a time when we used to refer to this evening as back to school night or open school night. The name has been changed. The purpose perhaps has remained the same. You have attended more than your share of
I have
those
attended
events.
quite a few of them, yes.
Have you seen any changes there?
I haven't attended any recently. There was a change in format. You worked by periods, and you could move from one room to another as a parent. Originally, you went to your child's teacher and sat there for an hour or so and spoke with and spoke about the whole group. Parents, unfortunately, now have less time. Although there are many working, both parents working in the early years in Brentwood, because this was always a lower income community.
Yes.
Where the doctors and the dentists were the wealthy people in the community. Exactly. But there still were quite a few parents at home. Now the number has changed, and what it really does is that it puts a greater responsibility on the teacher to be both teacher and, in many cases, a substitute parent.
Yes. For
some of the problems the children have, or for some of their activities, or for counseling. But we do a fantastic job here. Yes. I know teachers in our system today that spend hour after hour after school with the kids, helping them with their work or just talking with them. And that's what they need. They need to communicate with adults.
And the nature of how we once defined a serious problem has in some cases changed too.
Yes. The serious problem was dancing too close at a school dance, yes, exactly. Or wearing a skirt that was too short.
And that's another thing. The dress codes have seen quite a few changes over the years too, as we've redefined what a serious problem is.
Do you remember Mrs. What's her name? She's the head of the English department. Tall lady with her hair up in a beehive. When the English department, Cairns,
yes,
Cairns,
I do remember.
When the English department met, she used to bring in magnificent table covering, linens, fine linens, and excellent china and silver. And her teachers had to have the finest when they spoke as a group.
Wonderful, yes.
Fran Cairns. Actually, when I think of the teaching years, there's one memory that comes out, and even at the time it happened, I thought it was funny. I was discussing a new concept, and we'd been working all period on this one concept. And finally, at the end of the period, I asked the question, does anyone have any questions? And this one hand went up from Marilyn Huss, who was one of the brightest kids I'd ever taught. And I said, yes, Marilyn. She said, I didn't understand any of it. That changed my method in teaching quite a bit after that, but I remember that. I also remember one unpleasant experience that I have to tell you about. I had no problem with the kids. In fact, only one student in all those 5 years ever asked to be taken out of my class. He's now a teacher at Brentwood High School.
Marvelous. Wonderful.
But anyway, this one year, Mr. Weaver came around. He said, I have a problem youngster here. He said, I'm going to put him in your class because I think you can handle him. So the next day, this young man appeared. And he had a streak of meanness, of nastiness. And he was definitely prejudiced. And he was past remarks to me, hurting remarks. Just so happened, I also had most of the football team in that class. And they were getting very edgy. And one day, half of the class, the boys, didn't come in. And I was right next door to the boys' room. I heard some noise coming out of the boys' room. So I asked one of the boys who was there to go in and see what was happening. He came back and he said, oh, it's all right, Mrs. Rosenthal. They'll be in a minute. And the captain of the football team came in with all the football team behind him. And then following, all the way in the rear, was this young man who looked as if he had bumped into every door in the boys' room. And the captain came up to me and he said, Mrs. Rosenthal, I assure you, he will never bother you again. Never. And that afternoon, I went down to Mr. Weaver, and I said, you have to take this young man out of my class because I don't know if he'll be able to restrain himself, and my kids will probably kill him. Get him out. So he did. He took him out, and he put him in the class of one of the finest teachers I've ever known, who handled him beautifully.
That's wonderful.
Never bothered him, never came near me again.
Did I ask you this question before, Ruth? How did you decide to become a teacher? Who was the person that most influenced you in that direction?
Actually, we were out here in Brentwood, and my children had reached the age where the boys were in school and Laurel had entered, actually she entered St. Joseph's. She was there for 3 years because she was born one day too late for our schools. And she was very bright.
Yes.
So she went there for 3 years, had a wonderful education. Anyway, I wanted to help the family income. And I didn't want to go back to the office. I have a career status with the with civil service. In other words, at any time, probably even today, since they removed the age requirement, I could go in and demand that I be placed the next opening at my former rating. But I didn't want to do that. The kids were at home. They would come home from school, and there'd be no one home. So I decided, well, I'll try teaching. And that's how it happened. And I found out that I loved it.
Lo and behold, yes.
I loved it.
And you haven't had second thoughts about that decision, quite obviously, over the years. Before we finish, Ruth, and this has been a delight to me, I feel privileged to have been a part of this.
I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Is there anything that you want to add that we haven't talked about?
It doesn't concern me. It concerns the young people of this community.
Yes.
I attended a meeting the other day, which the principal speaker was, I forget his name, but he is the head of the LIA, Long Island Association. These are business people. And he said he said he's had a change of heart. He said he realized that education is a very important part of his business, of his prospects, and everyone on Long Island who is in business. And he said the most important thing you can do to restore the well-being of Long Island, the prosperity it's had, is to give us the best educated children you have. And best in whatever their interests are, whether it's academic or whether it's technology, whatever, the best. Computers, math, science, technology. He said, and that's our only clue, our only key to bringing Long Island back to its former prosperity. He said, we lost 500,000 jobs. We've gained back 100,000, but unfortunately, those 100,000 are entry-level jobs, many of them without any real prospect. He said, we need trained people. Those jobs are also here, and we need them. And I realized that for a community like this is critical.
Yes.
We can help with the education. And I'm also on one of the BOCES committees for planning technology. And BOCES can help, but we need the support of the community.
Yes.
We need the support for the other activities. Children who are in the green machine or in the football team or in the baseball team or whatever team you want, the children who are in the chorus or in the orchestra or whatever. These are not the young people who get into trouble.
Exactly.
It's the young people who don't have a focus, who don't have any leadership. And so the more we can offer them, especially in these days of absent parents,
yes,
the more important our role is. And that is what I feel has to be the direction in which this community will go in the future. I ache for the people here. I know that the taxes are horrendous. It is not the school's fault. It's not the school board's fault. It's Albany's fault. From going from almost 50% support of education, they're down to something like, I think, slightly under 30% now. That extra percentage has gotten right on the backs of the community, and we can't handle that as well as we used to. It's a hardship, a real hardship.
It's unfortunate that every time you think it can't get any worse, it
gets
always
worse.
does.
Yeah.
What would your message be to a young person just beginning a career in the classroom?
The kids need you. And if you don't feel that you can give them the affection, the love, the trust, the concern that they need, then get out of teaching. There are other fields. But if you're going to be a teacher and truly do what is probably the noblest of the professions,
I agree. Yeah.
Then do it well. But public education teaches Americanism and democracy and living with each other. And the fact that you have to deal with people of different abilities and of different concerns and different problems. If you're in a private institute and you have any problems, you're out. They won't handle it.
Yes.
You go back to the public schools.
Yes.
So it is a great Americanizing factor. And one that has, you're right, is the envy of the world.
Well, I can't thank you enough
for
being
I've
with us
enjoyed
today.
this tremendously.
I kind of warned you that we were going to take a trip down memory lane and do a lot of personal things that we don't have a chance to do when we're working and when we're encountering one another in the course of our responsibilities. But this has been a sheer delight, and I thank you for taking the time in your very active retirement to spend.
May I add one little thing?
Absolutely.
Fascinates me. When I was a child and you saw a penny on the ground, you picked it up because that penny could mean the difference between 9 cents and a dime.
Yes.
Or 24 cents and a quarter.
Yes.
And now, penny doesn't mean anything. People throw, and I realize I'm a child of the Depression.
Yes, yes.
It's still there with me.
But so are those values.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And that goes back to the question of the issue, I should say, of identity. You are the sum total, not just of your grandparents and your parents and your heredity, but also of the wonderful experiences that you've had. And this is part of the experience that we are now giving to others who hopefully will benefit from this conversation. Ruth.
Thank you again so much, John. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.